What if everything we think we know about the ancient world is wrong? The wind whispered through stones older than memory. I stood at the base of walls that should not exist, built by hands that somehow moved mountains. Dust clung to my fingertips as I traced joints so precise, not even a blade could slip between them. And I realized something. The ancients were hiding something. 15 fortresses, 15 impossible designs, stones weighing over 100 tons, fitted without mortar, water systems that still work after 1,500 years, concrete that heals itself, walls with no doors, cities carved into cliffs, and military historians who looked at these structures and had to admit one thing: they don't understand how any of it was built. How did the Inca move 300-ton boulders across mountain ranges without wheels? Why did a Bronze Age settlement build the world's first fortress 10,000 years before it should have been possible? What technology allowed Rome to create concrete that modern engineers cannot replicate? And why would anyone construct a fortress with no entrance, sealing something inside that was never meant to escape? This is where the journey begins, where every fortress holds a secret that no textbook dares to explain. You are the explorer now, and the ruins are waiting to speak, because history doesn't whisper, it waits. And these 15 fortresses have been waiting a very long time to tell their stories. The altitude pressed against my lungs as I climbed toward the fortress above Cusco. Then I saw them. Stones weighing more than 120 tons, fitted together without mortar, without gaps, without explanation. The Inca left no written record of how they did this. The Spanish chroniclers called it witchcraft. Modern engineers still cannot replicate the precision. I knelt beside one of the massive blocks and ran my hand along the seam where two boulders met. No tool marks, no mortar, just stone pressed against stone as if they had always been one. The fit is so tight that not even a piece of paper can slide between them. The stones have rounded corners and interlocking shapes that vary from block to block, each one unique, each one carved to perfection. The locals whispered something I wasn't ready to hear, that the Inca didn't build this place, that it was already here when they arrived. But the official history tells a different story. Construction began in the 15th century under Sapa Inca Pachacuti, the emperor who transformed Cusco into the heart of an empire. Over 20,000 men worked on this fortress, divided into teams. 4,000 quarried the stones, 6,000 transported them using massive cables of leather and plant fiber. The rest prepared the foundations and carved the timbers. The construction took 70 years. From 1431 to 1508, 3 generations of workers moving stones across 22 kilometers of mountain terrain without wheels, without draft animals, without anything we would recognize as machinery. And yet they succeeded in creating 3 zigzagging walls that stretch for 400 meters, reaching heights of up to 18 meters. Some individual blocks weigh over 300 tons. The fortress sits at an altitude of 3,701 meters above sea level. Up here, the air is thin. Every breath is work. Every step takes effort. And yet the Inca moved 200,000 stone blocks to this location and assembled them into a structure that has survived 500 years of earthquakes. The walls lean slightly inward. The corners are rounded. The blocks interlock in dozens of different configurations, all of it designed to absorb seismic stress and redistribute it through the structure. I stood at the base of the first wall and looked up. 5 meters of solid stone rising above me. The surface is polished smooth in some places, rough-hewn in others. Symbols of animals are carved into certain blocks: pumas, serpents, condors, the sacred creatures of Andean cosmology. The 3 walls are said to represent the 3 realms: Hanan Pacha, the upper world; K Pacha, the underworld. Spanish chronicler Inca Garcilaso de la Vega called Sacsayhuamán the pinnacle of Inca engineering. He described storage rooms filled with weapons, shields, arrows, and clubs, terraces and platforms designed for defense, 3 massive towers at the summit connected by underground passages, gates with trapezoidal openings, each one named Ajawana Punku, Tio Pumku. The fortress was not just a military installation, it was a religious center, an astronomical observatory, and a symbol of Inca power. But the question remains, how did they do it? Architect and explorer Vince Lee proposed a theory. The Inca carved the stones first, shaping them with precision before moving them. Then they lowered each block into place, fitting it into a prepared pocket in the wall. This would explain the tight joints, but it doesn't explain how stones weighing over 100 tons were transported across mountain ridges and valleys. It doesn't explain the speed of construction or the consistency of technique across decades of work. Some researchers have suggested the Inca used a form of primitive cement or bonding agent. Others believe they had knowledge of stone softening techniques, methods that would allow hard granite to be shaped like clay and then rehardened. But these theories are debated, dismissed by mainstream archaeology as speculation. What we're left with is the evidence itself, the stones, the walls, the precision that defies replication. I walked along the outer wall as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the zigzag ramparts. Each of the 3 walls has up to 40 segments, creating angles that would funnel attackers into kill zones and eliminate any cover. The design is brilliant, brutal, beautiful. And standing here in the fading light, I understood why the locals believe this place is older than the Inca, because something about these walls feels eternal, as if they were always here, as if they'll be here long after we're gone. And the question that brought me to this fortress, the question that keeps me searching through ruins and reading forgotten chronicles, remains unanswered. What knowledge did they possess that we've lost? What else did they build that's still waiting to be found? The rock rose 200 meters straight from the jungle floor, a monolith crowned with ruins. I began the climb at dawn, following ancient stairways carved into the cliff face. Halfway up, I stopped. Water was flowing, not trickling, flowing, from fountains built 1,500 years ago. No pumps, no electricity, just gravity, pressure, and an understanding of hydraulics that shouldn't exist in the 5th century. The engineers of Sigiriya built an entire water garden on top of a rock using underground conduits, cisterns, and pressure chambers. Even today, after the monsoon rains, those fountains still work. I stood there watching water arc into the air, wondering what else they knew that we've forgotten. This fortress was born from violence. King Kashyapa I, ruler of the Sinhalese Maurya dynasty, murdered his father King Datusena in the year 477 CE. He usurped the throne from his half-brother Maudalana, who fled to India vowing revenge. Afraid of retaliation, Kashyapa abandoned the traditional capital of Anuradhapura and moved his entire kingdom to a massive rock that jutted from the jungle like a fist raised against the sky. What is the definition? The name Sigiriya means lion rock. It comes from Sigiriya, a reference to the enormous lion gateway that once guarded the final ascent to the palace. Today, only the massive paws remain, carved from the living rock, each one larger than a man. Visitors must walk between those paws to reach the summit, passing through the mouth of a lion that no longer exists. King Kashyapa didn't just build a fortress, he built a statement. The rock itself was painted white, transformed into a shining beacon, visible for miles across the jungle. A strip of frescoes 5,600 square meters in size encircled the rock at the halfway point, depicting beautiful women known as the Sigiriya damsels. Some say they were celestial nymphs, others claim they were portraits of Kashyapa's concubines. Only 22 of these frescoes survive today, protected in a shallow cave on the western face. I continued climbing past the mirror wall, a polished surface that once reflected the frescoes so brightly that Kashyapa could see himself as he walked past. The wall is now covered in graffiti, scratched messages left by visitors between 600 and 1400 CE. Tourists from over 1,000 years ago, recording their thoughts in verse and prose. Some are poems, others are simple declarations. I was here. I saw this. I will remember. At the summit, the ruins of a 7-story palace spread across the flat top of the rock. The foundations are still visible, geometric outlines carved into the stone. A throne cut from solid granite sits at the northern edge, positioned to command a view of the entire kingdom. From here, Kashyapa ruled for 18 years, protected by his fortress in the sky. But the real genius of Sigiriya isn't the palace, it's the water. 2 massive moats surround the base of the rock. The outer moat was 52 meters wide and 4 meters deep. Spanish chronicles claim it was filled with crocodiles. The inner moat is 23 meters wide and still holds water today. Beyond the moats lie the gardens, a complex system of terraces, fountains, and pools that represent the oldest landscaped gardens in Asia. The water gardens are divided into 3 sections. Symmetrical pools at the base reflect the rock above. Limestone channels carry water from reservoir tanks hidden in the surrounding hills. The fountains operate on principles of gravity and pressure, using underground clay pipes to create hydraulic systems that still function 15 centuries later. During the monsoon season, rainwater fills the ancient cisterns and the fountains spring to life, just as they did in Kashyapa's time. Archaeologists discovered a sophisticated water management network that includes surface drainage channels, underground conduits, and pressure-releasing valves. The system not only supplied the palace and gardens with water, but also controlled flooding and erosion. It's a level of urban planning that rivals anything built in Europe during the same period. King Kashyapa ruled from his sky fortress until 495 CE, when his brother Moggallana returned with an army from India. During the battle, Kashyapa's own forces abandoned him. Realizing defeat was inevitable, the king fell on his sword, committing suicide rather than surrendering to his brother. Moggallana reclaimed the throne and moved the capital back to Anuradhapura. He converted Sigiriya into a Buddhist monastery, a place of peace where monks lived among the ruins of his brother's ambition. The monastery thrived for centuries, then gradually fell into decline. By the 12th century, Sigiriya was abandoned, swallowed by the jungle. It existed only in local legends and Buddhist chronicles until British archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1800s. Harry C.P. Bell conducted the first systematic survey in the 1890s, mapping the palace, documenting the frescoes, and revealing the engineering brilliance hidden beneath centuries of vegetation. I descended the stairs as the sun climbed higher, casting shadows that shifted across the rock face. 1,270 steps from summit to ground, each one carved by hand, each one part of a vision that defied gravity, defied logic, defied the idea that a kingdom could be built on top of a stone pillar in the middle of a jungle. And as I reached the base and looked back up at the rock towering above me, I wondered what it must have been like to stand at the top, to be Cassioppa looking down at the world he had claimed through violence and defended with genius. Did he know his fortress would outlast his kingdom? Did he understand that the water flowing through those ancient pipes would still be flowing long after his name faded into legend? They call it the Red Snake, a 120-mile wall stretching across the plains of northern Iran, older and more sophisticated than the Great Wall of China. I walked along its crumbling length, tracing the bricks with my fingers, each one stamped with the mark of the Sassanid Empire. This wasn't just a wall, it was a system. 38 forts lined its length, connected by a canal that fed water to every garrison. The Sassanids built this to stop the White Huns, to hold back an empire of horsemen that swept across Asia like wildfire. For centuries it worked. Then it was forgotten, buried under sand and time. Historians didn't even know it existed until the 90s. I stood at one of the forts and looked north, imagining the horizon filled with riders, and this wall the only thing standing between civilization and collapse. The Sassanid Empire ruled from 224 to 651 CE, stretching from Mesopotamia to the western edge of the Indian subcontinent. They were the last great Persian dynasty before the Arab conquest, and this wall was their masterpiece of military engineering. Construction began in the 420s CE under King Yazdegerd II. It continued through the reign of King Piruz and was finally completed during the time of Khosrow I, also known as Anushirvan the Just. 3 kings, over a century of labor, a national project that mobilized resources across generations. The wall stretches from the Caspian Sea in the west to the Pishkamar Mountains in the east, following the natural gradient of the land, a feat of hydraulic engineering that required surveyors to map terrain across 200 kilometers. The bricks are red, made from local clay, fired in kilns built alongside the wall itself. At peak construction, thousands of these kilns operated simultaneously, producing millions of bricks stamped with symbols and letters that identified their makers. The wall rises 10 feet high and 33 feet thick at the base, thick enough to absorb cavalry charges, high enough to stop scaling ladders. But the wall was never meant to stand alone. The Gorgan River flows parallel to much of its length, and the Sassanid engineers harnessed that water to create a defensive moat. Dams and channels diverted the river into ditches 10 meters wide and 4 meters deep, forming a barrier that cavalry could not cross. The water also supplied the forts, filled cisterns, and powered the brick kilns. Everything connected, everything intentional. The 38 forts were not simple watchtowers. They were military bases, each one equipped with moats, stables, food storage, command centers, and ironwork workshops. At peak occupancy, these forts could garrison 30,000 soldiers. 30,000 men stationed along a frontier that ran nearly 200 miles. The logistics alone are staggering. Behind the wall, archaeologists discovered something unexpected: campaign bases. Massive rectangular enclosures arranged in neat double rows, each one covering 40 hectares. the remnants of tent cities, temporary settlements for mobile field armies. The Sassanids didn't just defend the wall, they staged offensive operations from it, launching raids and counterattacks into enemy territory. The enemy was the Hephthalites, the White Huns, a confederation of nomadic tribes that dominated Central Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries. They destroyed the Gupta Empire in India. They destabilized the Northern Wei dynasty in China. And they pressed relentlessly against the northern borders of Persia. The Sassanids fought them for over a century, and the Great Wall of Gorgan was the physical manifestation of that struggle. Later, the Turks came, another wave of mounted warriors sweeping out of the steppe. The wall held against them too, creating a buffer that protected the heartland of the empire and allowed Persian culture to flourish in relative safety. The cities to the south grew wealthy, trade routes thrived, art and scholarship reached new heights, all because a line of red bricks and 38 forts kept the horsemen at bay. But walls can't stop everything. In 633 CE, Arab armies invaded Persia from the west. The Sassanid Empire collapsed within 2 decades, overwhelmed by a force they hadn't anticipated. The Great Wall of Gorgan was abandoned. Soldiers stationed along the frontier were recalled to fight in battles that would determine the fate of the empire. By the middle of the 7th century, the forts were empty. The kilns went cold. The wall became a ruin. For 1,300 years it sat there, slowly disappearing beneath soil and vegetation. The local population knew about it, but the outside world remained ignorant. Then, in the 1990s, satellite imagery revealed something extraordinary. A massive linear structure cutting across the landscape of northern Iran. Archaeologists arrived and began excavations. What they found rewrote the history books. The Great Wall of Gorgan is longer than Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall combined. It required more bricks than any other structure built in the ancient world. It demonstrates engineering knowledge equal to anything produced by Rome or China, and yet, until recently, it was virtually unknown. I walked along the remains of the canal, a depression in the earth marking where water once flowed. The system was so well designed that gravity alone moved water from the mountains to the forts, maintaining a steady supply without pumps or mechanical intervention. The Sassanids understood hydrology, logistics, and large-scale construction in ways that few civilizations could match. They built this wall to last forever, and in a sense, it has. Even in ruin, even forgotten, it endures, a testament to an empire that held the line when the world was collapsing. I knelt and picked up a fragment of red brick, still solid after 1,500 years. Somewhere on its surface, too worn to read, was the mark of the worker who shaped it, a name lost to history, a life spent building something that would outlast kingdoms. And as I stood there in the shadow of the red snake, I realized that some monuments are forgotten not because they weren't important, but because they succeeded so completely that the danger they defended against faded from memory. The wall did its job. The lion gate loomed above me. 2 massive stone lions carved into the entrance of a fortress so ancient the Greeks themselves believed giants built it. They called the wall Cyclopean because only the one-eyed monsters of myth could have lifted stones this large. I stepped through the gate and into the citadel of King Agamemnon, the man who launched 1,000 ships. The walls were not shaped, not carved. They were boulders, placed with such precision that smaller rocks and gravel filled the gaps without mortar. The entire fortress sat on a plateau with only one passable approach. Whoever built this understood something fundamental about defense. Control the approach, and you control the battle. I stood at the highest point and looked down at the Argolid plain. From here, Agamemnon could see everything, and so could I. Mycenae was the center of a Bronze Age civilization that dominated Greece from 1600 to 1100 BCE. The Mycenaean culture spread across the Mediterranean, establishing trade routes, building palaces, and waging wars that became the foundation of Greek mythology. The fortress itself dates to 1350 BCE, constructed during the height of Mycenaean power. The walls are 4.5 meters thick in places and extend for 900 meters around the Acropolis. Some of the limestone blocks weigh over 20 tons. Moving them without machinery, without wheels, without anything except human labor and ingenuity, remains a mystery that archaeologists struggle to explain. The Lion Gate is the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe. Two lionesses carved in relief, their front paws resting on altars flanking a central pillar. The heads are missing, likely made from a different material and lost to time, but the bodies remain, frozen in stone for over 3,000 years. The gate itself is constructed using a massive lintel stone weighing 20 tons, positioned above the entrance and supported by enormous jambs on either side. Above the lintel, the relieving triangle holds the lionesses, reducing the weight pressing down on the gate and preventing collapse. I walked through the gate and into the citadel. To my right, Grave Circle a circular enclosure discovered by archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. Inside, Schliemann found 6 shaft graves containing the remains of 19 individuals buried with gold masks, weapons, jewelry, and treasures that stunned the archaeological world. The most famous artifact, the Mask of Agamemnon, a gold funeral mask that Schliemann believed belonged to the legendary king himself. Modern dating suggests the mask predates the Trojan War by 300 years, but the name stuck. Beyond the graves, the palace complex rises on terraces cut into the rock. Throne rooms, living quarters, storage facilities, and a megron, the great hall where the king held court. The floors were decorated with frescoes and painted plaster. The walls were covered with murals depicting hunting scenes, warriors, and chariots. This was not just a fortress, it was a center of power, wealth, and culture. The water supply was critical. Mycenae had no natural spring within the walls, so the Mycenaeans built an underground cistern. A stairway descends 15 meters into the rock, leading to a chamber that collected water from a spring outside the citadel. The entire system was hidden, protected, designed to ensure the fortress could survive a prolonged siege without running out of water. To the north, the secret cistern. To the east, the sally port, a narrow postern gate that allowed defenders to launch surprise attacks on besieging forces. Every element of the design reflects military genius. The walls follow the natural contours of the hill, maximizing height advantage. The gates are positioned to force attackers to expose their unshielded right side as they approach. The towers provide overlapping fields of fire. Nothing was accidental. But the walls themselves are what captivate me. Cyclopean masonry. Massive irregular boulders fitted together without mortar, their weight and friction alone keeping them in place. The technique is simple in concept but staggering in execution. Each stone had to be shaped to fit the stones around it. The gaps had to be filled with smaller rocks and clay. The entire structure had to be stable enough to withstand earthquakes, weather, and time. The ancient Greeks believed the walls were built by the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants who forged Zeus's thunderbolts. No human, they reasoned, could move stones this large. The myth persisted for centuries, even as archaeologists uncovered evidence of Bronze Age construction techniques. Ramps, levers, rollers, and thousands of workers. The Mycenaeans didn't need giants. They had organization, planning, and the will to build something that would outlast their civilization. Mycenae fell around 1100 BCE. The citadel was destroyed, possibly by invasion, possibly by internal collapse. The palaces burned, the population scattered, the Bronze Age ended, and Greece entered a dark age that lasted for centuries. By the time Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey, Mycenae was already a ruin, its walls overgrown, its kings reduced to legend. I descended from the citadel as the sun set, casting long shadows across the Cyclopean walls. 3,000 years have passed since Agamemnon walked these stones. 3,000 years since warriors gathered in the Mehrangarh, since priests performed sacrifices at the altars, since craftsmen hammered gold into masks for the dead. And yet the walls remain, silent witnesses to a civilization that built fortresses so strong, so enduring, that even the gods were given credit for their construction. The Mycenaeans understood something that many civilizations forget. Power is temporary. Kingdoms rise and fall. But stone, properly placed, properly fitted, can last forever. The walls of Mycenae have survived invasions, earthquakes, and millennia of neglect. They have outlasted the Bronze Age, the Classical Age, the Roman Empire, and every dynasty that came after. And they will still be here, long after we're gone, proof that the ancients knew how to build not just for their time, but for eternity. I placed my hand on the lion gate one last time, feeling the rough texture of limestone worn smooth by countless hands before mine. Somewhere beyond these walls, the plains of Argos stretched into darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, the ghosts of Mycenae still stood watch, guarding a fortress that no longer needs defending. Because the greatest defense against time is not strength, it's permanence. And these walls, built by hands the Greeks thought belonged to giants, have achieved exactly that. The Judean desert stretched in every direction, and rising from it, a flat-topped mountain wrapped in walls. Masada. The name itself means fortress in Hebrew. I climbed the snake path, the ancient route that winds up the eastern face of the plateau. At the top, I found palaces, barracks, a synagogue, and cisterns that once held 200,000 gallons of water. Herod the Great built this place as a refuge, a fortress that could withstand any siege, and in the first century it did. A group of Jewish rebels called the Zealots held off the Roman legions for 2 years. 2 years on a rock in the desert. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they found silence. The Zealots had chosen death over slavery. I stood at the edge of the plateau and stared at the remains of the Roman siege ramp below, a monument to both Roman persistence and human defiance. Masada rises 400 meters above the Dead Sea, a natural fortress that Herod transformed into an impregnable stronghold between 37 and 31 BCE. He built 2 palaces, storerooms, an armory, and a sophisticated water system that could support a garrison for years without resupply. The northern palace clings to the cliff face in 3 tiers, each level carved into the rock and connected by narrow stairways. The upper terrace held Herod's private chambers, decorated with frescoes and mosaic floors. The middle terrace was a circular pavilion with columns, a place for contemplation overlooking the desert. The lower terrace, 20 meters below the summit, featured a bathhouse with hot and cold rooms, proof that Herod intended this fortress to be not just secure, but comfortable. The water system was the key to survival. 12 massive cisterns carved into the northern cliff face could hold 40,000 cubic meters of water. During the rainy season, flash floods in the wadis were diverted through channels into these cisterns, filling them with enough water to last years. Additional cisterns at the summit provided immediate access. The system was so well designed that even during prolonged droughts, Masada never ran dry. Herod surrounded the plateau with a casemate wall, a double wall with chambers in between that could serve as living quarters or storage. 30 towers rose along the perimeter, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. 4 gates allowed access to the fortress, but each one was heavily defended, designed to funnel attackers into killing zones. The entire complex covered 23 acres of the summit, enough space for hundreds of soldiers and their families. But Herod never used Masada as intended. He died in 4 BCE, and the fortress passed to Roman control, garrisoned by a small contingent of soldiers who maintained the structures but rarely saw action. For 60 years, Masada sat empty, a monument to paranoia that never materialized. Then came the First Jewish-Roman War. In 66 CE, Jewish rebels rose against Roman occupation. A group of Sigiriya, radical zealots led by Eleazar ben Yair, seized Masada from the Roman garrison and turned it into their base of operations. They were joined by survivors of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, refugees fleeing the destruction of the Second Temple. Together they fortified the plateau, prepared for siege, and waited. The Romans came in 73 CE. The 10th Legion, commanded by Flavius Silva, surrounded Masada with 8 siege camps and a circumvallation wall, a barrier that encircled the entire mountain to prevent escape. 15,000 Roman soldiers and Jewish slaves began construction of a siege ramp on the western face, the only side where the cliff was not completely vertical. The ramp took months to build. Thousands of tons of earth and stone were piled against the mountain, creating a slope that allowed siege engines to reach the summit. The defenders watched from above, throwing rocks and shooting arrows, but they could not stop the progress. The ramp grew higher, closer, inevitable. When the ramp was complete, the Romans brought up a battering ram mounted on a tower. They smashed through the wooden palisade the zealots had built behind the wall, but the defenders had prepared a second barrier, an inner wall made of timber filled with earth, designed to absorb the impact of the ram. The Romans responded by setting it on fire. As flames consumed the wall, the defenders knew the end had come. That night, Eleazar ben Yair gathered the 960 people on Masada, men, women, and children. According to the historian Josephus, who recorded the story based on the testimony of survivors, Eleazar gave 2 speeches. He argued that death was preferable to slavery, that freedom, even in death, was better than life in chains. He convinced them to commit mass suicide rather than surrender to Rome. 10 men were chosen by lot to kill the others. Families gathered together. Husbands killed their wives and children. The 10 men then killed the remaining defenders. Finally, 1 man, chosen by lot, killed the other 9 and then himself. When the Romans breached the walls the next morning, they found silence. 960 bodies, storerooms full of food and water, proof that the defenders had not been starved into submission. They had chosen death. 2 women and 5 children survived, hidden in a cistern. They emerged after the Romans entered and told the story. The Romans were stunned. They had expected resistance, a final battle, glory. Instead, they found only the dead and the legacy of a decision that would echo through history. I walked through the ruins of the synagogue, one of the oldest in the world. The benches where the zealots sat are still visible, carved into the stone. I stood in the bathhouse where Roman soldiers once relaxed, then later where Jewish rebels made their final preparations. I looked out over the desert, imagining the siege camps, the ramp, the legion waiting below. Masada is a symbol now, a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of choosing freedom over submission. Israeli soldiers take their oath of service at the summit, swearing that Masada shall not fall again. Tourists from around the world climb the snake path, following the steps of those who chose to die rather than surrender. And historians debate whether the mass suicide actually happened, or if it's a myth constructed to serve a narrative. But standing here, looking at the walls Herod built and the ramp the Romans constructed, I believe it happened. Because sometimes when there are no good options left, people choose the option that lets them define their own end. The zealots of Masada did not wait for Rome to decide their fate. They decided it themselves, and in doing so they turned a military defeat into a moral victory that has lasted 2,000 years. The fortress fell, but the memory endures, and that perhaps is the greatest defense of all. The limestone walls rose 15 feet thick at the base, 17 feet high, topped with brick ramparts and watchtowers. This was Troy, the city that controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Aegean, the city that survived for 1,000 years before a wooden horse brought it down. I walked along the reconstructed walls, imagining the layers beneath my feet. 9 cities built one on top of the other, each one destroyed, each one rebuilt. The fortifications evolved over centuries, growing stronger with every iteration. The Greeks didn't take Troy by force. They took it by deception, because the walls were impregnable. I placed my hand on the stone and wondered how many warriors had done the same. How many had stood here believing these walls would never fall? Troy sits at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and beyond to the Black Sea. Control this passage and you control trade between Europe and Asia. The city's wealth came not from agriculture or mining, but from its strategic location. Ships passing through the strait paid tribute, merchants seeking safe harbor paid fees. The first settlement dates to 3000 BCE. A small village on a limestone outcrop overlooking the plain. By 2500 BCE, Troy too had emerged, a fortified city with massive stone walls and a monumental gateway. This early Troy was destroyed by fire, but the ruins show evidence of gold, silver, and bronze treasures, proof that even in the Bronze Age, Troy was wealthy beyond measure. Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy between 1871 and 1890, convinced that Homer's Iliad described a real place. He was right, but his methods were crude. He dug trenches through the mound, destroying layers of archaeology in his rush to find the Troy of Priam and Hector. In the process, he found treasure, the so-called Priam's treasure, a hoard of gold jewelry, weapons, and vessels that Schliemann smuggled out of Turkey. Later analysis proved the treasure dated to Troy too, 1,000 years before the Trojan War. But Schliemann didn't care about accuracy. He cared about glory. Later excavations revealed the true complexity of the site. Troy 6, built around 1700 BCE, featured walls 6 meters thick constructed from massive limestone blocks. These walls enclosed an area of 200,000 square meters, large enough to house several thousand people. The city featured a complex water supply system, paved streets, and evidence of contact with the Mycenaean Greeks. This was the Troy that likely faced Agamemnon. Troy 7a shows evidence of destruction around 1200 BCE, consistent with the time frame of the Trojan War described in the Iliad. The city was burned. Human remains show signs of violent death. The archaeological evidence matches Homer's narrative, though proving that Achilles, Hector, and Helen actually existed remains impossible. What we know is that a city stood here, that it was besieged, and that it fell. But Troy didn't die. Troy 7b was rebuilt immediately, showing continuity of occupation. The survivors, or new settlers, constructed a smaller city on the ruins. Troy 8 emerged during the Greek Archaic period, around 700 BCE, as a Greek colony called Ilion. The inhabitants worshipped at a temple dedicated to Athena, believing themselves descendants of the heroes who fought in the legendary war. Alexander the Great visited Troy in 334 BCE, honoring the tomb of Achilles before launching his conquest of Persia. Troy 9 was built by the Romans, who renamed the city Ilium and constructed temples, theaters, and public buildings. The Romans believed they were descended from Aeneas, the Trojan hero who fled the burning city and eventually founded Rome. For the Romans, Troy was not just a historical site, it was the birthplace of their civilization. Emperors visited, paid tribute, and granted the city special status. Julius Caesar and Augustus both invested in Troy's restoration, transforming the ruins into a symbol of Roman identity. The walls I'm standing beside are reconstructions, built by modern archaeologists to show visitors what the defenses looked like. The original stones are still here, buried beneath layers of earth and rubble. 9 cities, 3,000 years of continuous habitation. Destruction and rebirth repeated so many times that the mound grew 20 meters high, a hill built from the ruins of previous versions of itself. What made Troy so resilient? Location. The city controlled a choke point that every empire needed. The Hittites, Mycenaeans, Greeks, Persians, and Romans all recognized Troy's strategic value. Even when destroyed, even when burned to the ground, someone always rebuilt, because the location was too valuable to abandon. The Trojan War, if it happened as described, was likely fought over trade and control, not beauty. Helen of Troy makes for a better story than tariffs and shipping rights, so Homer gave us an epic about love and honor. But the real reason armies besieged Troy was economics. The city charged tolls. The Greeks wanted free passage. War followed. I walked through the Scaean Gate, the entrance through which Hector supposedly rode to his death. The gate is restored, the stones fitted together using modern mortar, but the placement follows the original foundations. Beyond the gate, the plain stretches toward the coast. This is where the Greek camp stood, where Achilles brooded in his tent, where the funeral pyres burned. The geography matches the Iliad's descriptions, the distances, the landmarks, the topography. Homer knew this place, or he knew someone who did. The walls of Troy were designed to withstand assault, thick enough to absorb battering rams, high enough to prevent scaling, angled to deflect projectiles. Every gate was a choke point, forcing attackers into narrow passages where defenders could concentrate their fire. The fortifications were sophisticated, engineered by people who understood siege warfare and built accordingly. The Greeks couldn't breach the walls, so they built a horse and relied on deception. Sometimes the best defense against walls is not strength, it's cunning to a console jungle. Troy fell, not because its walls were weak, but because its people made a mistake. They opened the gate, they brought the horse inside, and the warriors hidden within did what siege engines could not. They opened the city from within. The lesson of Troy is not that walls fail, it's that walls are only as strong as the people defending them. Trust the wrong person, make the wrong decision, and the strongest fortress in the world becomes a tomb. I left Troy as the sun set, casting long shadows across the plain. The walls stood silent behind me, reconstructed reminders of a city that survived 1,000 years and fell in a single night. 9 cities rose and fell on this spot, and somewhere beneath the earth, the bones of heroes and merchants and soldiers lie buried, waiting for someone to dig them up and tell their stories. Troy is not just a fortress. It's a reminder that no defense is permanent, that every wall, no matter how strong, eventually falls, and that sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from outside. It walks in through the front gate wearing the face of a gift. No one knows who built it. The walls rise over 10 meters high, constructed with massive stone blocks reinforced with earthworks. The design is a hybrid, blending Chinese fortification styles with elements that seem to come from the nomadic steppe cultures of the north. I walked through the narrow gates, designed to choke any invading force into a killing ground. The fortress features interlocking walls and towers, each one positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. It's a masterpiece of defensive architecture. But there are no records, no inscriptions, no clues about who lived here or why they abandoned it. Local historians call it the fortress with no name. I call it a puzzle waiting to be solved, because something this sophisticated doesn't just appear and disappear without leaving a trace. The Hejin city fortress sits in Shanxi province, a region that has seen empires rise and fall for thousands of years. The Yellow River flows nearby, a lifeline that brought prosperity and conflict in equal measure. Whoever controlled this territory controlled trade routes, agricultural lands, and access to the northern steppes. The fortress was built to defend something valuable, but what exactly remains unclear. The construction technique is what baffles experts. The lower walls are stone, massive blocks quarried from nearby mountains and fitted together with minimal mortar. Above the stone base, rammed earth layers reinforce the structure, creating a composite wall that combines the strength of stone with the flexibility of packed earth. This technique was common in China during the Warring States period and later dynasties, but the specific style of stonework at Hejin suggests outside influence. Some researchers believe the fortress dates to the Northern Wei dynasty, around 400 to 500 CE, when northern China was ruled by the Tuoba clan, descendants of nomadic Xianbei tribes. The Tuoba had adopted Chinese administrative systems, but retained their martial traditions. They built fortresses along the frontier to defend against raids from other steppe peoples. Hejin could be one of these hybrid structures, a fortress designed by Chinese engineers with input from steppe warriors who understood cavalry tactics. Others argue the fortress is older, possibly dating to the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE to 200 CE. The Han emperors pushed Chinese influence deep into Central Asia, building fortifications along the Silk Road and establishing military colonies in hostile territory. Hejin's location would have made it strategically valuable during this period, a strong point controlling access to the central plains from the northern highlands. But there's another possibility, that the fortress was built by a forgotten kingdom, a local power that thrived for a century or two and then vanished, absorbed by larger empires or destroyed by invasion. Chinese history is filled with such kingdoms, regional powers that left behind ruins but little else. The spring and autumn period alone saw dozens of states competing for dominance. Most were conquered and their records destroyed. Hejin could be a remnant of one of these lost powers. What we do know is that the fortress was designed for war. The gates are narrow, forcing attackers to enter single file where defenders could cut them down. The walls are thick enough to withstand battering rams and siege engines. The towers provide elevated positions for archers and crossbowmen, creating kill zones at every approach. Inside, the layout suggests barracks, storerooms, and command structures, everything needed to support a garrison during prolonged conflict. I climbed to the highest tower and looked out over the surrounding landscape. Hills rise to the north, providing natural barriers against cavalry charges. To the south, the plain stretches toward the Yellow River, flat and open, ideal terrain for farming, but vulnerable to invasion. Whoever built this fortress understood the geography. They positioned it to control the gap between the hills and the river, a choke point that any invading army would have to pass through. The lack of inscriptions is unusual. Chinese dynasties were meticulous record keepers, carving dedications, commemorations, and imperial edicts into stone. Every major structure built by a Chinese emperor or governor bears some mark of its creator, but Hejin has nothing. No steles, no carved tablets, no evidence of who commissioned the construction or why. It's as if the builders deliberately left no trace of their identity. Local legends offer some clues, though legends are unreliable. One story claims the fortress was built by a general who rebelled against his emperor and needed a stronghold to defend against imperial forces. He fortified Hejin, gathered an army, and prepared for war. But before the battle could be fought, he was betrayed and assassinated. His followers scattered, and the fortress was abandoned. Without a leader, it had no purpose. Another legend says the fortress was cursed, that the builders uncovered something during construction, a tomb or a shrine, and disturbed the spirits within. Misfortune followed. Crops failed. Soldiers fell ill. The garrison commander ordered the site abandoned, and the fortress was left to the elements. No one returned, fearing the curse would spread. These are stories, not history, but stories often contain fragments of truth, distorted by time and retelling. Perhaps there was a rebellion. Perhaps there was a disaster. Perhaps the fortress was simply bypassed by changing trade routes and rendered obsolete. Empires shift. Borders move. What was once critical becomes irrelevant. And when a fortress loses its purpose, it's abandoned. I descended from the tower as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the walls. The fortress stood silent, as it has for centuries. No soldiers patrol the ramparts. No fires burn in the courtyards. Just stone and earth slowly reclaiming what humans built. But the design remains, a testament to whoever created it. They understood warfare. They understood engineering. They built something meant to last, and it has, even if their names have not. The Hejin city fortress is a reminder that history is incomplete. We know the names of emperors and the dates of battles, but we don't know everything. There are gaps, places where the records end and speculation begins. This fortress is one of those gaps. A structure that exists but refuses to be categorized. refuses to fit neatly into the timeline of Chinese history. And perhaps that's fitting, because the best fortresses are the ones that keep their secrets, even after their walls have fallen. Hejin has kept its secret for over 1,000 years. And standing here, looking at walls that no one can name, I wonder if we'll ever uncover the truth, or if some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, reminders that the past is deeper and stranger than we can imagine. The ramparts rose in waves, 3 concentric rings of earth and stone, each one higher than the last. Maiden Castle was not just a fortress, it was a statement. Built around 150 BCE, it covered an area large enough to house thousands. The eastern entrance was a maze, designed to confuse and slow attackers. I stood at the top of the outer rampart and looked down. The slope was steep enough that a sling stone launched from here could travel 140 meters, and they found the evidence. Over 50,000 sling stones brought from Chesil Beach scattered around the eastern gate. The defenders fought hard. But in 43 CE, the Roman Second Legion under Vespasian breached the walls. The resistance was so fierce that Vespasian himself would later become emperor. I knelt and picked up a piece of worked flint, wondering which defender had held it last. Maiden Castle sits on a chalk plateau in Dorset, southern England. The site has been occupied for over 6,000 years, but the massive earthworks we see today were constructed during the Iron Age by the Dorotragus tribe. They transformed a simple hilltop settlement into the largest Iron Age hill fort in Britain, covering 47 acres with defenses so elaborate that they still inspire awe 2,000 years later. The construction was a monumental undertaking. The outermost rampart rises 20 meters above the surrounding ditch. The second rampart adds another layer of defense. The innermost rampart protects the central plateau where the main settlement stood. Each layer required thousands of tons of chalk and earth to be excavated, shaped, and piled into banks that could withstand assault. The ditches between the ramparts were dug deep, creating obstacles that cavalry could not cross and infantry would struggle to climb. The eastern entrance is a masterpiece of defensive design. Instead of a simple gate, the Dorotragus created a winding passage that forced attackers to navigate a series of turns and choke points. Wooden palisades lined the route, creating kill zones where defenders on the ramparts could rain down sling stones, spears, and arrows without fear of return fire. Any army attempting to storm the gate would be funneled into a narrow corridor where numbers meant nothing and skill meant everything. The western entrance was simpler, but no less effective. A single passage through the ramparts, heavily fortified, designed to be held by a small number of defenders against overwhelming odds. The entire fortress was laid out to maximize the advantage of terrain, using height, angles, and narrow passages to neutralize superior numbers. Inside the ramparts, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of hundreds of roundhouses, storage pits, and workshops. Maiden Castle was not just a military installation. It was a town, a center of trade and culture where people lived, worked, and raised families. The storage pits held grain, evidence of agricultural surplus. The workshops produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork. This was a thriving community, protected by walls that seemed unbreachable. But in 43 CE, Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of Britain. The Second Augustan Legion, commanded by Vespasian, landed on the south coast and began a systematic campaign to subjugate the tribes of southern England. Maiden Castle was one of the primary targets, a symbol of resistance that had to be broken. The Roman assault was brutal. Ballistae, massive siege weapons capable of hurling iron bolts with enough force to pierce shields and armor, were deployed against the eastern gate. The defenders responded with slingstones, thousands of them, launched from the ramparts in volleys designed to break the Roman advance. But the legionaries were disciplined, experienced, and equipped with artillery that the Durotrigs could not match. Archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler excavated Maiden Castle in the 1930s and uncovered evidence of the battle. A war cemetery near the eastern gate contained the remains of defenders killed during the assault. One skeleton had a Roman ballista bolt embedded in the spine. Others showed signs of sword wounds, evidence of hand-to-hand combat at the gates. The defenders fought to the last, but they could not hold. The Romans breached the defenses and stormed the fortress. What happened next is unclear. Some accounts suggest the population was massacred. Others claim the survivors were enslaved or allowed to flee. What we know is that Maiden Castle was abandoned shortly after the Roman conquest. The ramparts were left to decay. The roundhouses collapsed. The once thriving town became a ruin. Vespasian's success at Maiden Castle and other hill forts in southern Britain earned him a reputation as a capable commander. Decades later, during the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE, that reputation helped him claim the imperial throne. The man who stormed Maiden Castle became the founder of the Flavian dynasty, the emperor who built the Colosseum and restored stability to Rome. I walked along the outer rampart, following the path the defenders would have taken as they prepared for battle. The ditches are still visible, though softened by centuries of erosion. The ramparts are still high, though grass and wildflowers have replaced the palisades. From here, I could see for miles across the Dorset countryside, imagining the Roman legions advancing in formation, their shields locked, their discipline unbreakable. Maiden Castle is a monument to resistance. The Durotriges built something extraordinary, a fortress that used every advantage of terrain and engineering to create an impregnable stronghold. They stockpiled weapons, trained defenders, and prepared for a siege that would test their resolve. And when the Romans came, they fought with everything they had. But walls, no matter how high, cannot stop a determined empire with superior technology and discipline. The Romans had artillery, organization, and the will to pay any price for victory. The Durotriges had courage and slings. It was never going to be enough. I descended from the ramparts as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the ancient earthworks. Maiden Castle stands as a testament to what can be achieved with determination and ingenuity. The Durotriges built a fortress that would have been impregnable against any Iron Age army. But they faced Rome, and Rome did not accept defeat. The hill fort fell, but its memory endures. The ramparts remain, proof that the people who lived here understood defense, understood engineering, and understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when victory is impossible. Maiden Castle did not save the Durotriges, but it immortalized them, and sometimes that's the only victory that matters. The outer wall was carved from solid rock. A man-made moat encircled the entire fortress, deep enough to stop siege towers, wide enough to keep battering rams at bay. I crossed the narrow bridge and entered the outer courtyard. Krak des Chevaliers was built to withstand a siege for 5 years. The Hospitallers, who expanded this fortress, understood something about endurance. Arrow slits covered every angle, eliminating dead ground. Machicolations crowned the walls, allowing defenders to drop stones or boiling oil on attackers below. The design was so advanced, so complete, that the castle was considered virtually impregnable, and for over a century, it was. No army took Krak to Chevaliers by force. Only negotiation and deception finally brought it down. I stood in the chapel at the heart of the fortress and felt the weight of history pressing in from all sides. Krak de Chevaliers sits on a 650-meter-high hill in western Syria, overlooking the strategic Homs Gap, a valley that connects the Mediterranean coast to the interior. Control this pass, and you control movement between the sea and Damascus. The fortress was originally an Arab stronghold called Hisn al-Akrad, the Castle of the Kurds. Kurdish troops garrisoned it in the 11th century, defending the approach to Homs. In 1109, during the First Crusade, Tancred of Antioch captured the castle. It remained in Crusader hands until 1142, when it was given to the Knights Hospitaller, a military order dedicated to protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. The Hospitallers saw the strategic value immediately. They transformed a modest hilltop fortification into the most formidable castle in the Middle East. The construction took decades. The Hospitallers rebuilt the entire structure, adding concentric walls, towers, chapels, storerooms, and cisterns. The outer wall was 3 meters thick in places, reinforced with buttresses and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The inner wall rose even higher, creating a second line of defense that could hold even if the outer wall fell. The moat was carved from bedrock, a trench circling the fortress that prevented siege engines from approaching the walls. A narrow causeway provided the only access, crossing the moat to a heavily fortified gate. The entrance was a death trap. Attackers had to cross the causeway under fire from the towers, pass through a gate that could be sealed with a portcullis, and then navigate a winding passage designed to slow any assault. Murder holes lined the ceiling, allowing defenders to drop projectiles on anyone who made it inside. Inside the outer wall, the Hospitallers built barracks, stables, and workshops. The fortress could garrison 2,000 soldiers during wartime, with additional space for refugees fleeing Muslim armies. The storerooms held enough food to last 5 years, a stockpile that made starvation sieges pointless. Cisterns collected rainwater, ensuring the garrison would never run out of water. The Hospitallers designed Krak des Chevaliers to be self-sufficient, a fortress that could hold out indefinitely against any army. The inner courtyard features a Gothic loggia, a covered walkway with arched columns that would look more at home in a European monastery than a military fortress. The Hospitallers built a chapel dedicated to St. George, complete with frescoes and carved stonework. They constructed a great hall for feasting, a chapter house for meetings, and private chambers for the Grand Master. Krak des Chevaliers was not just a fortress, it was a symbol of Crusader power, a statement that they intended to stay. The defenses were tested repeatedly. In 1163, Nur ad-Din, the Sultan of Syria, laid siege to Krak des Chevaliers with an army that vastly outnumbered the garrison. The siege lasted months, but the fortress did not fall. The walls held, the supplies lasted, and eventually Nur ad-Din withdrew, unable to breach the defenses or starve out the defenders. In 1188, Saladin, the legendary Muslim general who recaptured Jerusalem, marched on Krak des Chevaliers with his full army. He surrounded the fortress, deployed siege engines, and prepared for a prolonged assault. But after a brief bombardment, Saladin withdrew. The fortress was too strong, the garrison too well supplied. Taking Krak des Chevaliers would cost thousands of lives and months of campaigning. Time Saladin did not have. He left it standing, a thorn in the side of Muslim Syria that could not be removed. For over a century, Krak des Chevaliers remained in Crusader hands. It served as a base for raids into Muslim territory, a refuge for Christian pilgrims, and a symbol of defiance against Muslim reconquest. The Hospitallers controlled the surrounding region, collecting taxes and tribute from local villages. The fortress was the center of a small Crusader state, an island of Christian power in a sea of Muslim armies. But the Crusades were failing. One by one, the Crusader kingdoms fell. Jerusalem was lost. Acre was besieged. The supply lines from Europe grew thin. By 1271, Krak des Chevaliers was isolated, cut off from reinforcements, garrisoned by a skeleton force that could not be replaced. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars saw an opportunity. Baybars laid siege to Krak des Chevaliers in March of 1271. He brought siege engines, trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones against the walls. For a month, the bombardment continued, day and night, pounding the outer defenses. The walls cracked, the towers crumbled, but the garrison held. Then Baybars used deception. He forged a letter, supposedly from the Grand Master of the Hospitallers, ordering the garrison to surrender. The defenders, believing the letter was genuine, negotiated terms. They were allowed to leave the fortress and retreat to the coast under safe conduct. On April 8, 1271, the gates of Krak des Chevaliers opened, and the Hospitallers marched out, banners flying, defeated not by force but by trickery. Baybars entered the fortress and marveled at what he found. The walls were damaged but still standing, the storerooms were full, the cisterns held water. The garrison could have held for months, perhaps years, but they believed the latter. And so the most impregnable castle in the Crusader states fell without a final assault. I stood at the highest point of the inner wall and looked out over the Homs Gap. The valley stretched below, green and fertile, dotted with villages. From here, the Hospitallers watched caravans, monitored armies, and controlled access to the interior. For over a century, this fortress was the key to the region, and it never fell by force, only by deception, only by a forged letter that convinced brave men to abandon walls that had held against Saladin himself. Krak des Chevaliers stands as a monument to military architecture. The Hospitallers built something perfect, a fortress designed to withstand any siege, any assault, any enemy, and it worked. For over 100 years it worked. But even the strongest walls cannot defend against doubt, against a letter that seems authentic, against the belief that surrender is the only option. The fortress never fell. The men inside chose to leave. And sometimes that's the difference between victory and defeat. The walls curved in perfect ellipses. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, rising over 30 feet high. Great Zimbabwe was the largest structure in sub-Saharan Africa, built between the 11th and 15th centuries by a civilization the colonial archaeologists refused to believe was African. I walked through the great enclosure, running my fingers along stones that had been shaped to fit together like a three-dimensional puzzle. The outer wall alone contains 182,000 cubic feet of stone. Inside, smaller walls form passages and enclosures leading to the conical tower, a structure whose purpose remains unknown. There are no inscriptions, no written records, just the stones themselves, proof that a sophisticated civilization thrived here, controlling trade routes and building monuments that would outlast empires. I stood in the shadow of the tower and listened to the wind whisper through gaps in the stone. Great Zimbabwe sits in the southeastern highlands of modern Zimbabwe, near the town of Masvingo. The name means houses of stone in the Shona language, a reference to the massive dry stone constructions that define the site. The complex covers 1,800 acres with 3 distinct areas. The hill complex, perched on a granite outcrop and believed to be the royal residence. The valley ruins, a series of smaller enclosures where the general population lived, and the Great Enclosure, the largest single ancient structure south of the Sahara Desert. The civilization that built Great Zimbabwe emerged around the 11th century, part of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a powerful state that controlled gold and ivory trade routes connecting the African interior to the Swahili coast. Arab and later Portuguese traders came to the coast seeking gold, and Great Zimbabwe was the source. The kingdom grew wealthy, powerful enough to construct monuments that would rival anything built in Europe during the same period. The walls of the Great Enclosure are the most impressive feature. They rise 11 meters high in places, thick enough at the base to support their own weight without mortar or binding agents. The stones are granite, cut and shaped to fit together through friction alone. The top of the wall is decorated with a chevron pattern, a geometric design that runs for hundreds of meters, proof that aesthetics mattered as much as function. Inside the Great Enclosure stands the conical tower, 5.5 meters in diameter at the base, 10 meters high, solid throughout, no entrance, no interior chamber, just a massive cone of granite rising from the earth. Archaeologists have debated its purpose for over a century. Some believe it's a symbolic grain bin representing prosperity. Others argue it's a phallic symbol associated with fertility and kingship. A few suggest it served an astronomical function, aligned with celestial events. No one knows for certain. The hill complex overlooks the valley, a natural fortress enhanced with stone walls and terraces. This was likely the residence of the king and his court, a place of power separated from the common people below. Inside the hill complex, archaeologists discovered soapstone birds, carved sculptures unique to Great Zimbabwe. 8 were found, each one depicting a bird of prey perched on a column. These birds became the symbol of modern Zimbabwe, featured on the national flag. But their original purpose remains a mystery. Were they totems, religious icons, royal insignia? The civilization that created them left no explanation. Great Zimbabwe reached its peak between 1200 and 1450 CE. At its height, the city housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people, a major urban center by medieval standards. The economy was based on cattle herding, agriculture, and most importantly, trade. Gold from nearby mines was transported to the coast, where it was exchanged for glass beads, porcelain, and cloth from India, China, and Persia. Archaeologists have found these trade goods throughout the site, proof that Great Zimbabwe was connected to a global network. But around 1450 CE, the city was abandoned. The population dispersed. The trade networks collapsed. Why? The most likely explanation is environmental. The region could not support the large population indefinitely. Overgrazing depleted the grasslands. Deforestation reduced timber supplies. The gold mines were exhausted. Without resources, the city could not sustain itself. The people moved north, establishing new kingdoms like Mutapa and Butua, successors to Great Zimbabwe that continued the cultural and political traditions. When Portuguese explorers arrived in the 16th century, they found the ruins abandoned, overgrown with vegetation. They asked local people who built the city. The answers were vague: ancestors, gods, foreigners. The Portuguese concluded that Great Zimbabwe must have been built by someone other than the local African population. They suggested the Queen of Sheba, King Solomon, Phoenician traders, anyone except the indigenous people. This myth persisted for centuries, a convenient excuse for colonialism. If Africans were incapable of building great civilizations, then Europeans were justified in conquering them. In the late 19th century, European archaeologists began excavating Great Zimbabwe. The first digs were treasure hunts, not scientific investigations. Artifacts were removed, sold, or destroyed. The stratigraphy was ignored, and when evidence pointed to an African origin, it was dismissed or suppressed. The Rhodesian government, which ruled the region until 1980, actively censored research that credited Africans with building Great Zimbabwe. Books were banned. Archaeologists were silenced. It wasn't until after Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 that the truth became widely accepted. Radiocarbon dating, architectural analysis, and comparison with other African sites proved beyond doubt that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. The construction techniques, the pottery, the settlement patterns all matched indigenous traditions. There was no foreign influence, no lost civilization, just Africans building a city that reflected their power, wealth, and sophistication. I walked along the outer wall of the great enclosure, placing my hand on stones that had been fitted together 700 years ago. The surface was rough, weathered by centuries of rain and wind. But the structure was solid. The walls had not collapsed. The tower still stood. The enclosures still defined spaces that once teemed with life. Great Zimbabwe endures because it was built to last, because the people who constructed it understood stone, understood architecture. The colonial archaeologists who refused to believe Africans built this place were wrong, willfully, deliberately wrong. They looked at evidence and chose to ignore it because it contradicted their worldview. But the stones don't lie. The walls don't care about politics or prejudice. They stand as proof that African civilizations achieved greatness long before Europeans arrived. That Great Zimbabwe was a center of trade, culture, and power. That the people who lived here built something extraordinary. I stood at the base of the conical tower as the sun set, casting long shadows across the enclosure. The purpose of the tower is still unknown. Perhaps it will always be unknown. But that doesn't diminish its significance. Great Zimbabwe is a monument to human achievement, to the ability of a civilization to transform stone into art, into architecture, into a legacy that survives centuries after the people who built it have vanished. The walls remain, the tower stands, and the story of Great Zimbabwe, once suppressed, once denied, is finally being told. The fort rose 400 feet above Jodhpur, a structure so massive that Rudyard Kipling said it looked like it had been built by titans. I climbed the winding path to the first gate, Jai Pol, the victory gate built to commemorate a triumph over rival kingdoms. 7 gates in total, each one a checkpoint, each one a place where defenders could stop an advancing army. The walls were thick enough to absorb cannon fire. The battlements bristled with cannons of their own, heavy pieces like Bawani and Kilkila, designed to overwhelm attackers before they could get close. Inside, the fort was a city unto itself, with palaces, temples, and courtyards built over 500 years by different rulers. Each edition reflected the architectural styles of its time, from Rajput to Mughal. I stood at the ramparts and looked down at the city below, understanding why this fort never fell. Mehrangarh means Fort of the Sun. The name comes from Mihir, the sun god, and Gar, meaning fort. Rao Jodha, the 15th ruler of the Rathore clan, founded the fort in 1459 after moving his capital from Mandor to the rocky outcrop that would become Jodhpur. The location was strategic, a natural fortress rising from the Thar Desert, visible for miles in every direction. The construction was brutal. According to legend, Rao Jodha evicted a hermit named Chiriya Nathji from the hilltop to build the fort. The hermit cursed the site, declaring that the rulers would always suffer from water shortages. To this day, Jodhpur struggles with water scarcity, and some locals believe the curse is real. To appease the hermit's spirit, Rao Jodha built a temple in his honor within the fort walls, a gesture that did nothing to lift the curse. The fort's foundations are built directly into the rock, making the walls an extension of the hill itself. The outer walls rise up to 36 meters in places, constructed from red sandstone quarried nearby. The thickness varies, but in some sections the walls are 21 meters wide at the base, tapering as they rise. These walls were designed to withstand cannon fire, a necessity in an era when gunpowder weapons were transforming warfare. The 7 gates are each named for a different reason. Jaipal, the Victory Gate, commemorates Maharaja Man Singh's defeat of the armies of Jaipur and Bikaner in 1860. Fatehpur, the Victory Gate, marks another military triumph. Lohapul, the Iron Gate, features spikes designed to prevent war elephants from battering it down. Dedkangrapal, the Gate of 1.5 curves, is named for its winding approach. Each gate served a defensive function, slowing attackers and creating kill zones where defenders on the walls could rain down arrows, stones, and later bullets. Beyond the gates, the fort is a maze of courtyards, palaces, and temples. Moti Mahal, the Pearl Palace, features walls covered in mirror work and gold leaf. Phul Mahal, the Palace of Flowers, was a private chamber for the Maharajas, decorated with elaborate frescoes and stained glass. Sheesh Mahal, the Mirror Palace, is lined with mirrored tiles that reflect candlelight, creating the illusion of stars in the night sky. Each palace represents a different era, a different ruler's vision of what a royal residence should be. The fort's armory is one of the finest in India. Swords with hilts of jade and gold, daggers with blades that can pierce chainmail, shields covered in rhinoceros hide, thick enough to stop arrows, and cannons, dozens of them, positioned along the battlements. The most famous is Kilkilla, the Kilkilla cannon, named for the sound it makes when fired. These weapons were not decorative, they were used in battle, defending the fort against Mughal armies, rival Rajput clans, and later British forces. The Rathore rulers of Mehrangarh were warriors. They fought the Mughals for centuries, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies. They maintained their independence through a combination of military prowess, strategic marriages, and fortifications that made conquest too costly. The Mughal emperors could have taken Mehrangarh if they had committed enough resources, but the fort was positioned in a desert, far from the centers of Mughal power. Besieging it would require months of campaigning in hostile terrain with limited water and supplies. The Mughals chose diplomacy instead, forming alliances through marriage and tribute. The British arrived in India in the 18th century, and the Rathores adapted. Rather than fight a colonial power with superior technology and endless reinforcements, they negotiated treaties. Mehrangarh remained in Rathore hands throughout the British Raj, though the rulers were now subordinate to the British crown. The fort was never stormed, never captured, never reduced to ruins like so many other Indian fortresses. It survived because the people who controlled it understood when to fight and when to negotiate. I walked through the museum that now occupies much of the fort. Glass cases display artifacts from centuries of rule. Palanquins used to carry royalty. Howdahs, the seats mounted on elephants for battle and ceremony. Miniature paintings depicting court life, hunting expeditions, and military campaigns. Each object tells a story, a fragment of a history that spans over 500 years. From the ramparts, I look down at Jodhpur, the blue city. The houses are painted blue, a color traditionally associated with the Brahmin caste but now adopted by the entire city. The blue rooftops stretch in every direction, a sea of color broken by the occasional temple or palace. From this height, the city looks peaceful, but 500 years ago, this view would have shown armies approaching, trade caravans arriving, and the daily life of a fortress that controlled the desert. Mehrangarh never fell because it was too strong, too well positioned, and too expensive to take. The walls absorbed cannon fire. The gates held against battering rams. The garrison had water from wells dug deep into the rock, enough to outlast any siege. And the rulers understood that fortresses alone do not guarantee survival. Diplomacy, alliances, and knowing when to bend rather than break, these were the strategies that kept Mehrangarh in Rathore hands for over 5 centuries. I descended from the fort as the sun began to set, casting the walls in shades of gold and red. The fort lives up to its name. In the morning light, it glows like the sun itself, a beacon rising from the desert. It has survived wars, sieges, empires, and the passage of time. The walls still stand, the palaces still gleam, and the legacy of the Rathores, warriors who built a fortress that could never be taken, endures. Mehrangarh is not just a fort, it's a monument to resilience, to the understanding that the best defense is not just walls and cannons, but the wisdom to know when to fight and when to survive. I stood before the oldest fortification in the world, a stone wall dating to 8000 BCE, over 10,000 years old. The wall was accompanied by a round tower, 8 meters high, a structure that predates written history, agriculture, and everything we think we know about early human society. Jericho was a settlement that chose to build walls when most humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers. I climbed to the top of the excavated tower and looked out over the ancient city. Archaeologists still debate why the wall was built. Was it for defense against enemies or protection against floods? Either way, the people of Jericho understood something crucial. Security requires effort, and they were willing to invest that effort 10,000 years ago. I placed my hand on the stone and felt the weight of human history beneath my palm. Jericho sits in the Jordan Valley, near a natural spring that has provided water for 11,000 years. The spring, known as Aina Sultan, produces over 300 gallons of water per minute, creating an oasis in an otherwise arid landscape. Where there is water, there is life, and where there is life, there is settlement. The first inhabitants arrived around 9600 BCE, establishing one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth. These early residents were pre-pottery Neolithic A people, hunter-gatherers transitioning to a sedentary lifestyle. They built round houses with mud brick walls and plaster floors. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes, and at some point, they decided to build a wall. The wall is 3.5 meters wide at the base and rises nearly 4 meters high in the excavated sections. It is constructed from undressed stone, field stones stacked and fitted together without mortar. The wall originally encircled the settlement, protecting an area of approximately 6 acres. Inside the perimeter lived between 2,000 and 3,000 people, a massive population for the Neolithic period. But the wall alone is not what makes Jericho extraordinary. It's the tower. The round stone tower attached to the interior of the wall rises 8.5 meters high. It is solid at the base with a staircase of 22 stone steps spiraling up through the interior, leading to a flat platform at the top. The stairs are narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Each step is carefully shaped, evidence of planning and craftsmanship that should not exist 10,000 years ago. Why build a tower? The standard answer is defense. The tower provided a vantage point to spot approaching enemies. But some archaeologists disagree. The tower faces away from the valley, toward the hills. If defense was the goal, it is poorly positioned. An alternative theory suggests the tower had an astronomical function. On the summer solstice, the setting sun aligns perfectly with the peak of Mount Parantal. As viewed from the top of the tower, perhaps the tower was not military, perhaps it was religious, a monument to the sun or the seasons. Another theory proposes that the wall and tower were built to protect against floods and mudslides. The Jordan Valley is prone to flash floods, and the wall could have served as a barrier to divert water away from the settlement. The tower might have been a platform for observing water levels or coordinating flood response. This would make Jericho the first known example of civil engineering, infrastructure designed not for war but for survival against nature. Regardless of its purpose, the construction required organization. Quarrying the stones, transporting them to the site, shaping them, and stacking them into a stable structure demanded coordination, planning, and labor. Thousands of person-hours went into building the wall and tower. This was not a project undertaken by a few families. It was a community effort, proof that the people of Jericho had developed social structures capable of mobilizing collective action. The settlement thrived for centuries. The inhabitants cultivated wild grains, domesticated plants, and eventually developed agriculture. They traded obsidian from Anatolia and shells from the Red Sea, evidence of long-distance trade networks. Jericho was not an isolated village. It was a hub, a crossroads connecting different regions and cultures. Around 8000 BCE, the pre-pottery Neolithic A culture was replaced by pre-pottery Neolithic B. The new inhabitants built rectangular houses instead of round ones. They continued to use the wall and tower, adding to them, maintaining them. The site remained occupied, the traditions passed down, the structures preserved. But eventually, around 6000 BCE, Jericho was abandoned. The reasons are unclear: environmental change, resource depletion, conflict, or a combination of factors. The settlement was reoccupied later, but the original wall and tower were buried beneath layers of new construction. Archaeologists rediscovered the ancient wall in the 1950s. Kathleen Kenyon led excavations that revealed the true age of the fortifications. Radiocarbon dating placed the wall and tower at 8000 BCE, making them over 10,000 years old. This challenged everything scholars thought they knew about the development of civilization. Monumental architecture was supposed to come after agriculture, after cities, after writing. But Jericho had monumental architecture before any of those developments. The discovery forced a re-evaluation of the Neolithic period. It proved that complex societies could emerge before agriculture became widespread, that people could organize large-scale construction projects while still relying primarily on hunting and gathering, that the drive to build, to create permanent structures, is older than civilization itself. I descended from the tower and walked along the base of the wall. The stones are weathered, smoothed by 10,000 years of exposure. Some sections have collapsed, others remain standing, testament to the skill of the builders. These are not primitive structures. They are engineered, designed to last, built by people who understood weight, balance, and stability. The Wall of Jericho is a monument to human ambition. 10,000 years ago, when most humans wandered in search of food, the people of Jericho chose permanence. They chose to stay in one place, to invest in infrastructure, to build walls that would protect their settlement for generations. They did not have metal tools. They did not have written plans. They had stone, determination, and the vision to create something that would outlast them. Standing here, touching stones placed by hands that lived 10 millennia ago, I am confronted with a simple truth. We are not as modern as we think. The impulse to build, to defend, to create monuments is ancient. The people of Jericho understood the same truths we do. That security requires effort, that communities need protection, that walls, no matter how primitive, can mean the difference between survival and extinction. They built the first fortress, and in doing so, they set a precedent that civilizations have followed ever since. The wall stands, even in ruin, and the message is clear. Humanity has always built walls, and we always will, because some things never change, and the need for security, for permanence, for a place to call home is one of them. The pillars rose from the earth like sentinels, T-shaped megaliths carved with animals, symbols, and figures that no one can fully interpret. Göbekli Tepe was built 12,000 years ago by people who were not supposed to have the knowledge, the tools, or the organization to create something like this. I walked among the stone circles, each one older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than agriculture itself. The site contains astronomical alignments tracking the star Sirius and the solstices. And then, around 10,000 years ago, it was deliberately buried. Thousands of cubic meters of dirt and debris carefully packed around the pillars, sealing them away. Why? No one knows. The site was rediscovered in the 90s, and it has rewritten everything we thought we knew about the rise of civilization. I knelt beside one of the pillars and traced the carved relief of a fox, wondering what message the builders were trying to send across the millennia. Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, overlooking the Hejin Plain. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, a reference to the shape of the mound that concealed the ruins for 9,000 years. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavations in 1996, expecting to find a modest Neolithic settlement. What he discovered changed archaeology forever. The site consists of multiple circular enclosures, each one built at different times over a span of 2,000 years. The oldest structures date to 9600 BCE, placing them firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Before pottery, before agriculture, before settled communities. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, nomads who should not have had the resources or motivation to construct monumental architecture. Each enclosure features two massive T-shaped pillars at the center, surrounded by smaller pillars arranged in a circle. The pillars are carved from limestone, quarried from outcrops a few hundred meters away. The largest pillar weighs over 16 tons and stands 5.5 meters tall. Moving stones of this size without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools required hundreds of workers and sophisticated knowledge of leverage, ramps, and coordination. The pillars are not plain. They are covered in carvings. Foxes, lions, bulls, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and wild boars. Abstract symbols that might represent constellations or clan totems. Human arms carved on the sides of the T-shaped pillars, suggesting the stones represent stylized human figures. Some pillars feature loincloths carved at the waist, confirming they are anthropomorphic. These are not just stones, they are beings, guardians, representations of something the builders considered sacred. The enclosures were not habitations. No evidence of cooking fires, no hearths, no domestic refuse. The structures were ceremonial, places where people gathered for rituals, feasts, or worship. Animal bones found at the site show evidence of butchering and roasting, suggesting communal meals. Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, a temple complex that drew people from across the region. But here's where it gets strange. Around 8000 BCE, after 2,000 years of use, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The enclosures were filled with dirt, rubble, and debris. The pillars were covered. The entire site was sealed, transformed into a mound that blended into the landscape. This was not accidental. It was intentional, a massive undertaking that required as much effort as the original construction. Why bury a site that took generations to build? Theories abound. Some suggest environmental change. The climate was warming. Forests were disappearing, and a hunter-gatherer lifestyle was becoming unsustainable. Perhaps the people moved on, and burying the site was a ritual closure, a way to honor what had been and move toward what was next. Others propose religious transformation. As agriculture emerged, new beliefs replaced old ones. The temple of the hunter-gatherers was no longer relevant, so it was sealed, a symbolic death. Another theory is more ominous, that Göbekli Tepe was buried to hide it, to protect it from invaders or rival groups, that the people who built it faced a threat so severe that they chose to erase their sacred site rather than let it fall into enemy hands. This would make the burial an act of defiance, a refusal to let outsiders desecrate what had been holy. The astronomical alignments add another layer of mystery. Researchers have identified carvings that match known constellations. One pillar features a vulture, a scorpion, and other animals arranged in a pattern that corresponds to the summer solstice sky around 10,500 BCE. Another enclosure is oriented toward the rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. The builders were tracking celestial events, recording them in stone, creating a calendar or cosmology that linked the Earth to the heavens. This suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Hunter-gatherers were supposed to be concerned with survival, not stargazing. But the people of Göbekli Tepe were doing both. They hunted gazelles, gathered wild grains, and mapped the sky. They understood cycles, seasons, and the movement of stars. And they encoded that knowledge into a temple that would outlast their civilization. The implications are staggering. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture, yet it required organization and labor that archaeologists assumed only agricultural societies could muster. It predates cities, yet it functioned as a regional center, drawing people from distant areas. It predates writing, yet it contains symbolic language carved into stone. Everything we thought we knew about the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting to farming, is wrong. Göbekli Tepe suggests that monumental architecture came first, and agriculture followed, that people built temples before they built villages, that religion, not food, was the driving force behind civilization. I stood at the edge of one of the excavated enclosures and looked down at the pillars. They have stood here for 12,000 years. They were old when the pyramids were built. They were ancient when Rome rose and fell. They predate every known civilization, every written language, every city. And yet they are sophisticated, deliberate, meaningful. The people who carved these stones understood something profound about the world, about the sky, about the human need to create lasting monuments. Göbekli Tepe is not a fortress in the traditional sense. There are no walls, no gates, no defenses, but it is a stronghold of a different kind, a fortress of belief, a place where ideas were defended, where rituals were preserved, where the old ways were honored even as the world changed. And when the time came, when the old ways could no longer survive, the people buried their temple and walked away. They left behind a mystery carved in stone, waiting 9,000 years for someone to uncover it. I descended the hill as the sun set, casting long shadows across the pillars. Göbekli Tepe stands as proof that we do not know the full story of humanity, that there are chapters missing, civilizations forgotten, knowledge lost. The people who built this place were not primitive. They were visionaries, and they left behind a monument that challenges every assumption we have about the past. The pillars remain, the carvings endure, and the questions they raise have no easy answers. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Göbekli Tepe is not what it tells us, but what it forces us to reconsider, that the ancients were not less than us. They were different, and in some ways they were more. The dome should not be standing. 142 feet in diameter, unreinforced, built nearly 2,000 years ago. And yet it remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. I stood beneath the oculus, the circular opening at the center of the dome, and watched light pour through. The concrete itself is alive, not biologically but chemically. When rainwater seeps into cracks, it triggers reactions with mineral deposits embedded in the ancient mix. The minerals expand, filling the cracks before they can spread. It's a self-healing technology that modern engineers are still trying to replicate. The Romans didn't just build for the present, they built for eternity, and they succeeded. I ran my hand along the interior wall and felt the subtle texture of the concrete, a material that has outlasted empires, survived earthquakes, and continues to repair itself after 2 millennia. The Pantheon was commissioned by Marcus Agrippa during the reign of Augustus around 27 BCE. That original structure burned down. The building standing today was rebuilt by Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE, though Hadrian modestly kept Agrippa's name on the inscription. The Pantheon was dedicated to all the gods of Rome, a temple where citizens could worship the entire Roman pantheon in one place. The dome is the engineering marvel. It spans 43.3 meters, exactly equal to its height from the floor, creating a perfect hemisphere. If you extended the curve downward, it would form a complete sphere that fits precisely within the building. This geometry was intentional, a representation of the celestial sphere, the vault of heaven brought to earth. The construction required innovation. Roman concrete, or opus caementicium, was made from lime mortar, volcanic ash called pozzolana, and aggregate. The volcanic ash was key. It contained silica and alumina that reacted with lime to create a hydraulic cement that could set underwater and grew stronger over time. The Romans discovered this material through trial and error, refining the mixture over centuries. For the Pantheon's dome, the engineers varied the aggregate. The base of the dome used heavy travertine and brick. As the dome rose, lighter materials were incorporated. Tufa, a porous volcanic rock, was used in the middle sections. At the top, near the oculus, pumice was added, a stone so light it floats. This gradual reduction in weight decreased the load on the structure, allowing the dome to support itself without internal reinforcement. The dome is also not uniform in thickness. It is thickest at the base, nearly 6 meters, and thins as it rises, reducing to just 1.2 meters at the oculus. This tapering further reduces weight while maintaining structural integrity. The interior features coffers, recessed panels that create a waffle pattern. These are not decorative. They reduce material, decreasing weight while adding visual interest. Each coffer is smaller than the one below it. The oculus is 9 meters in diameter, open to the sky. Rain falls through, landing on the sloped marble floor that drains through holes into a drainage system beneath the building. The opening serves multiple purposes. It reduces weight at the apex where stress is greatest. It illuminates the interior with natural light that moves across the walls and floor as the sun crosses the sky. And it connects the earthly temple to the heavens, a literal portal between human and divine realms. But the most remarkable feature is the concrete itself. Modern analysis has revealed why Roman concrete has lasted 2,000 years while modern concrete crumbles after decades. The secret is in the chemical reactions that continue long after construction. When rainwater enters microcracks, it dissolves the volcanic ash and lime. The dissolved minerals precipitate as new crystals, filling the cracks and bonding the concrete together. The material heals itself, repairing damage before it can spread. Scientists have identified a rare mineral called aluminum tobermorite in Roman concrete. This mineral forms through prolonged exposure to seawater or rainwater and acts as a binding agent, growing within the concrete and reinforcing it. Modern concrete uses Portland cement, which lacks the reactive minerals found in Roman pozzolana. Modern concrete is stronger initially, but it degrades over time, especially in marine environments. Roman concrete was weaker at first, but grew stronger, adapting to its environment, like a living organism. Researchers are now studying Roman concrete to develop self-healing materials for modern construction. Incorporating volcanic ash and lime into new concrete mixes could create infrastructure that repairs itself, reducing maintenance costs and extending the lifespan of buildings, bridges, and dams. The Romans discovered this technology by accident. We are rediscovering it through science. The Pantheon has survived because it was repurposed. When Rome fell and pagan temples were abandoned, the Pantheon was consecrated as a Christian church in 609 CE. This saved it from destruction. While other Roman buildings were quarried for stone or left to decay, the Pantheon was maintained, repaired, and protected. It became Santa Maria ad Martyrs, the Church of St. Mary and the Martyrs, and remains an active place of worship. The building has endured earthquakes, floods, and wars. It was looted during the sack of Rome in 410 CE. Pope Urban VIII removed bronze from the portico to cast cannons for Castel Sant'Angelo and to create the baldachin in St. Peter's Basilica. This act inspired the saying, "What the barbarians did not do, the Barberini did," a reference to Urban's family name. Despite these indignities, the structure survived. I stood in the center of the rotunda and looked up through the oculus. A shaft of light descended through the opening, illuminating the interior with a glow that shifted as clouds passed overhead. Rain fell through the oculus earlier, and the floor was damp, the drainage system still functioning after 1900 years. The dome curved above me, coffers receding into shadow, the geometry perfect. The Pantheon is not a fortress in the traditional sense. It has no walls designed to repel invaders, no gates to withstand siege, but it is a fortress of knowledge, a monument to engineering principles that allowed Rome to build an empire. The dome demonstrates mastery of materials, geometry, and construction that would not be equaled for over 1,000 years. The Renaissance architects who built the great cathedrals of Europe studied the Pantheon, measuring its proportions, analyzing its construction, trying to understand how the Romans achieved what they did. Filippo Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon before designing the dome of Florence Cathedral. Michelangelo called it an angelic design, not human. Architects continue to visit, to measure, to marvel. Because the Pantheon proves that with the right knowledge, the right materials, and the right vision, humanity can create structures that transcend time. I walked toward the exit, passing the tomb of Raphael, the Renaissance master buried here in 1520. He rests beneath the dome he admired, in a building that has outlasted every empire that has ruled Rome since its construction. The Pantheon stands because the Romans built it to last, because they understood materials, understood engineering, understood that some buildings are not just for the present but for all time. The dome remains, the concrete heals, and the legacy of Rome endures, cast in a material that refuses to die. The walls average 10 feet thick. There is no visible entrance, no exit, just a complex system of tunnels and chambers that seem to lead nowhere. I first heard about this fortress from a local guide who refused to take me there. He said it was cursed, that everyone who tried to map the interior got lost. I went anyway. The structure is a marvel of ancient engineering, but its purpose remains a complete mystery. Some believe it was a tomb, sealed after the burial was complete. Others think it was a vault, designed to protect something so valuable that even the entrance had to be hidden. I circled the perimeter twice, searching for any gap, any sign of how the builders got in or out. Nothing, just smooth stone and silence. As I stood there in the fading light, I realized that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us that we don't know everything, and that the past still has secrets we haven't earned. The fortress sits in a remote valley, accessible only by foot after hours of hiking through terrain that seems designed to discourage visitors. No roads lead here, no signs mark the way. The local population knows about it, but speaks of it in whispers, a place of power or danger depending on who you ask. The name of the fortress has been lost, if it ever had one. Maps do not show it. Archaeological surveys have overlooked it. It exists in the gap between recorded history and local legend. The walls are constructed from massive stone blocks, fitted together with precision that rivals Sacsayhuamán or the pyramids. The surface is weathered but intact, showing no signs of doors, gates, or windows. The fortress is roughly circular with a diameter of approximately 100 meters. The walls rise 12 meters high, smooth and vertical, impossible to climb without equipment. At the top, the wall curves inward slightly, preventing anyone from scaling it even if they reach that height. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the internal structure. Chambers, corridors, and what appear to be stairways, all carved into the bedrock beneath the fortress. The tunnels spiral downward, descending at least 30 meters below ground level. Some passages connect to chambers, others end abruptly, sealed by stone blocks or collapsed sections. The layout suggests intentional design, not natural caves. Someone built this. But why? The local guide who warned me away told a story passed down through generations. Long ago, a king built the fortress to hide a treasure so valuable that kingdoms would go to war for it. He gathered the finest craftsmen, the best engineers, and ordered them to create a vault that could never be opened. They worked for years, carving tunnels into the rock, constructing chambers deep beneath the earth. When the work was finished, the king placed the treasure inside and sealed the entrance. Then, to ensure the secret would never be revealed, he had the craftsmen executed. Their knowledge died with them. The treasure remains hidden, protected by stone and silence. Another story claims the fortress was not built to keep people out, but to keep something in. That the chambers below hold a creature, a demon, or a weapon too dangerous to destroy. The walls were not defenses. They were a prison. The lack of a door was not a design flaw. It was a precaution, ensuring that whatever was sealed inside could never escape. This version of the story is older, predating the treasure legend by centuries. It speaks of sacrifices, rituals performed to bind the entity within the stone. The locals avoid the fortress not out of respect, but out of fear. Archaeologists have studied the site, though only a handful have published findings. The consensus is that the fortress dates to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BCE. The construction technique matches other megalithic structures from the same period, using large stones shaped and fitted without mortar. But the lack of an entrance is unprecedented. Every known fortress, tomb, or vault has some way in, even if it's hidden or sealed. This structure has nothing. Some researchers propose that the entrance was above ground, a door or gate that has since eroded away or been deliberately removed. If the fortress was built on a mound and the entrance was at the top, erosion over 3,000 years could have obliterated all traces. But ground scans show no evidence of a collapsed entrance, no voids where a passage might have existed. The walls are solid, continuous, unbroken. Another theory suggests the entrance is underground, a tunnel that connects to the fortress from a location outside the walls. This would explain the internal chambers and corridors. The builders could have dug tunnels from a hidden location, carved out the fortress from within, and then sealed the access tunnel when the work was complete. This theory is popular among treasure hunters who have spent decades searching the surrounding area for a hidden entrance. None have been found. I entered one of the tunnels discovered by previous expeditions. A narrow opening at the base of the wall, partially obscured by vegetation, leads into the darkness. The passage is tight, requiring me to crawl on hands and knees. The stone is cold, damp, slick with moisture that seeps through from above. 20 meters in, the tunnel opens into a chamber, a circular room carved from solid rock. The walls are smooth, almost polished, evidence of deliberate shaping. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal rises from the floor. It is empty. Whatever it once held is gone. Beyond the chamber, the tunnel continues, descending deeper. I followed it as far as I dared, my flashlight barely piercing the darkness. The air grew colder, the walls narrower, and then, without warning, the tunnel ended. A solid wall of stone, seamless and smooth, blocking further progress. I pressed my hand against it, searching for cracks or seams. Nothing. The wall is part of the bedrock, as if the tunnel was always meant to end here. I retraced my steps, emerging into the fading daylight. The fortress stood silent above me, its walls casting long shadows across the valley. Whatever secrets it holds remain hidden, buried beneath stone that has resisted 3,000 years of weather, erosion, and human curiosity. The treasure, if it exists, is still inside. The creature, if the legends are true, is still imprisoned. Or perhaps there is nothing inside. Perhaps the fortress is empty, a monument to paranoia or hubris, built by people who wanted to create a mystery that would outlast their civilization. I left the valley as night fell, looking back once at the fortress silhouetted against the darkening sky. The walls stood as they have for millennia, unyielding, impenetrable, silent. The locals say the fortress has no door because it was never meant to be opened, that some things are sealed away for a reason, and curiosity is not justification enough to break those seals. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps some mysteries are warnings, reminders that not all knowledge is meant to be discovered, that some doors, even invisible ones, should remain closed. The fortress with no door stands as the ultimate enigma, a structure that defies explanation, that raises more questions than it answers. Who built it? Why? What is inside? And most importantly, how do you enter a fortress that has no entrance? These questions have no answers. Only theories, legends, and the silent testimony of stone walls that refuse to yield their secrets. And perhaps that is the point, that the greatest fortress is not the one that can withstand assault, but the one that cannot be entered at all. A defense so complete that even the passage of time cannot breach it. The fortress stands, the secret remains, and the door, wherever it is, stays hidden, just as the builders intended. Another piece of the puzzle. Another secret swallowed by the ages. 15 fortresses scattered across continents and centuries, each one a testament to human ingenuity, fear, ambition, and the eternal drive to build something that outlasts flesh and bone. From the stone walls of Jericho, 10,000 years old, to the self-healing concrete of Rome, each fortress tells the same story. That survival requires effort. That security demands sacrifice. That the greatest achievements of humanity are not born from comfort, but from the desperate need to defend what we have built against those who would take it away. These walls were raised by hands that understood mortality. The Inca who fitted stones at Sacsayhuamán knew they would never see the fortress completed. The Sassanids who built the Great Wall of Gorgan knew their children would inherit the watch. The Zealots at Masada chose death because they understood that some walls are not made of stone, but of principle, and that principle, once breached, can never be rebuilt. Standing in the shadow of these ruins, I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper, it waits. It waits in the gaps between fitted stones, in the curve of a dome that should have collapsed centuries ago, in the walls that have no doors and the fortresses that never fell. It waits for us to stop, to listen, to trace the seams with our fingers, and ask the question that every explorer must eventually face. What did they know that we've forgotten? The fortresses remain, some in ruin, some intact, all of them monuments to civilizations that rose, thrived, and vanished. The walls outlasted the empires that built them. The engineering outlasted the engineers. The mysteries outlasted the answers. But I've learned something else, that the greatest fortresses are not the ones that cannot be breached. They're the ones that make you question what you thought you knew. The ones that stand in defiance of explanation, refusing to fit neatly into our timelines and theories. They are riddles carved in stone, challenges issued across millennia, daring us to solve them. And as I close this chapter of the expedition, packing my notes and preparing for the next journey, I understand that the search will never end, because for every fortress we uncover, 10 more wait beneath the soil, beneath the jungle, beneath the desert sand, hidden, forgotten, waiting for the explorer who refuses to accept that history is settled. The dust still clings to my boots. The stones still hold their secrets. And somewhere out there, another wall is waiting. Another fortress that shouldn't exist. Another mystery that history forgot to solve. This journey ends, but the expedition continues, because the ruins are patient, and they have all the time in the world.